December 20th, 1943. A frozen morning over northern Europe. The air was thick with fog and the bitter scent of oil and exhaust. Across the airfields of eastern England, young men climbed into machines of steel and rivets, bombers nicknamed flying fortresses. They were called that for a reason. Heavily armed, thick-skinned, and built to carry death deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. One of those bombers was a B-17 they called Ye Olde Pub. Its pilot was just 21 years old, Charles "Charlie" Brown, a farm boy from West Virginia who had barely been shaving when the war began. He'd trained hard, studied every manual, every emergency checklist, and now it was his turn to lead a crew of 10 men into the skies. Their target that morning, a ball-bearing plant near Bremen, Germany. They climbed into the sky in tight formation, hundreds of bombers shimmering in the cold winter light. Beneath them, the North Sea stretched like a sheet of glass. Above them, vapor trails crisscrossed against the blue. Charlie gripped the controls, feeling the vibration of the 4 Wright Cyclone engines through his gloves. His co-pilot Spencer Luke gave a nervous grin. "First mission as the boss," he said. Charlie smiled back, though his stomach was knotted. Every man in that aircraft trusted him to bring them home. As they crossed the German coast, the radio filled with static and warning calls. "Bandits at 12 o'clock. Flak ahead." The first black puffs of anti-aircraft fire erupted in front of them, each one a thunderclap of smoke and steel. The bombers flew straight into it. They had to. To turn away would mean failure, and failure wasn't an option. A shell exploded just below them. Shrapnel sliced through the fuselage. The oxygen lines ruptured. The nose was shredded. The right stabilizer gone. Ye Olde Pub shuddered and dropped from formation. In that instant, they were alone. No friendly gunners nearby. No protective circle of bombers. Just one dying plane limping through enemy skies. Within seconds, German fighters swarmed. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs diving from above, guns blazing. Bullets ripped through the bomber's tail, tore open the side, and killed the tail gunner instantly. Charlie felt the entire ship lurch. "Hang on," he shouted. "We're hit." The intercom crackled, voices yelling, panicked. "I'm hit. Oxygen's gone. We've lost number 3 engine." Smoke poured from the right wing. The B-17 was barely holding altitude. Every control felt sluggish. Still, Charlie refused to give up. His training kicked in. He shouted orders, checked the gauges, adjusted the trim. They were dropping fast, but alive. Minutes later, more fighters attacked. A burst of cannon fire tore through the cockpit, shattering the glass. A bullet grazed Charlie's shoulder. Another ripped into the co-pilot's leg. He could smell blood and hydraulic fluid mixing with the bitter cold. Oxygen masks frosted over from each breath. Behind him, several crewmen lay unconscious. Others tried to bandage wounds with shaking hands. The radio was dead. The compass useless. They had no navigation, no escort, and no idea how far they were from the coast. Still, Charlie gritted his teeth and turned the bomber west. England lay somewhere beyond the horizon. He whispered to himself, "Just get them home." Outside, the air was eerily quiet now. The attacking fighters had peeled away. Smoke trailed behind Ye Olde Pub, marking it like a wounded bird across the German countryside. And then, from behind a cloud, came another shape, a single Messerschmitt Bf-109, sleek, fast, deadly. The black cross on its side gleamed in the sunlight. Charlie saw it instantly. "Fighter! 6 o'clock high," he shouted, but no one could man the tail gun. It had been blown apart. The bomber was defenseless. The German fighter closed in, steady and precise. Inside sat 30-year-old Lieutenant Franz Stigler, an ace of the Luftwaffe, credited with multiple kills. Franz had taken off minutes earlier, refueled and rearmed, hunting for stragglers returning from the Bremen raid. He saw the damaged bomber below and thought, "This one's mine." He climbed, positioned behind the B-17, and placed his hand on the trigger. Through his gun sight, he could see every wound the bomber had suffered. The tail torn away, the fuselage riddled with holes, the rear guns hanging useless. But as he moved closer, something inside him changed. He saw movement through the holes in the fuselage, men, wounded, slumped over. He saw the tail gunner's body motionless, half hanging from the turret. He moved closer still, close enough to see faces. The glass was shattered, but through the cockpit window he could see the pilot, young, blood on his forehead, gripping the controls with determination. Franz hesitated. He remembered his commanding officer, Gustav Rödel, a man of strict honor. Rödel had once told his pilots, "You fight with honor. You do not kill a man who cannot fight back. If I ever see you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." Looking at the crippled B-17, Franz realized these men were no different than those hanging in parachutes. They were helpless, struggling just to stay alive. His finger lifted from the trigger. For a moment the sky stood still, the hunter and the hunted, face to face. Charlie saw the German plane off his wingtip. He braced for the end. But no bullets came. Instead, the fighter held position, almost protectively. Franz gestured with his hand, signaling for them to turn and land. He pointed downward, meaning, "Land here. Surrender. Save yourselves." Inside the B-17, Charlie shook his head. He couldn't risk capture. His wounded crew needed medical help. But in England, not a German prison. He kept flying west. Franz realized what he intended to do, to keep going across the North Sea. He sighed, then fell into formation beside them. Two enemies flying side by side, below German anti-aircraft batteries locked onto the lone bomber. Franz moved closer, positioning his Bf-109 alongside year-older pub, shielding it. The gunners below saw the German fighters' markings and hesitated. Surely no American plane would fly wing to wing with one of their own. They held their fire. For the next 10 minutes, Franz escorted the bomber across the German coastline. He stayed just close enough to deter the flak crews, careful not to be spotted by other patrols. As they reached the edge of the sea, he drew up alongside the cockpit. Through the shattered glass, Charlie looked at him. Really looked. Two men, two enemies, staring across a few feet of cold air. Franz raised his hand in a salute. Charlie, dazed and bleeding, returned it. Then Franz banked away, rolled over the bomber once, and disappeared into the clouds. Charlie watched him go, disbelief in his eyes. Then he turned back to the controls. "Let's get home," he muttered. Somehow, impossibly, the B-17 made it. Over the North Sea, they lost another engine. They nearly ditched twice, but hours later they limped over the English coast. At the base, ground crews ran to meet them. The aircraft looked like it had been stitched together by hand, holes the size of fists in every panel. One propeller gone, the tail shredded, the nose smashed. Yet it had flown. As the medics carried out the wounded, Charlie collapsed against the fuselage, staring at the bullet holes. Somewhere out there, the German who had spared them was still flying. When he told his superiors what had happened, they listened in silence, then ordered him to forget it. Never speak of it again. If word got out that German pilots could show mercy, it could weaken the resolve of Allied crews. It might humanize the enemy. Charlie nodded, but inside he knew he'd never forget. He completed his tour, flew more missions, and returned home after the war. He rejoined the Air Force years later, served with distinction, and eventually retired. But some nights the dream returned. The sky over Germany, the crippled bomber, and the German fighter pulling alongside instead of firing. He would wake up sweating, heart pounding, whispering the same question he'd carried for decades. Who was he? Meanwhile, somewhere across the Atlantic, another man was asking a different question. Franz Stigler never told anyone what he had done that day. He landed his fighter, shut off the engine, and sat in silence. He knew he had risked everything, his career, his freedom, even his life. But deep down, he knew he had done the right thing. He had seen enough death to last a lifetime. Germany was burning. His comrades were dying faster than replacements could arrive. The glory of the Luftwaffe was gone, replaced by desperation. After the war, Franz survived the chaos of Germany's collapse, the occupation, the hunger, the shame. In 1953, he immigrated to Canada, hoping to start over. He became a successful businessman, known for his precision and kindness. But inside, the memory of that day stayed alive. The battered B-17, the young pilot's face, the salute. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could still see it. The sunlight reflecting off the bullet holes, the faint motion of hands working inside the fuselage. He wondered if they had made it, if they'd survived, or if the bomber had crashed into the cold North Sea, he would never know. Not yet. For 40 years, neither man spoke of that day. The war ended, but the memories didn't. Charlie Brown came home to America, a survivor, a decorated pilot, and like so many others, a man trying to rebuild his life. He went to college, married his sweetheart, raised a family, and built a career that took him across the world. He rejoined the Air Force in 1949, this time as part of the newly formed United States Air Force, no longer the Army Air Corps of his youth. He flew in peacetime missions, trained younger pilots, and eventually became a Foreign Service officer, working in countries torn by conflict, Laos, Vietnam, places where echoes of war never seemed to stop. But at night, when the world went quiet, the same images came back. The holes in the bomber, the smoke, the face of the man in the German fighter. He never forgot those eyes, steady, calm, human. Sometimes he'd wake in the dark, heart pounding, unsure where he was. His wife would ask what was wrong, but he'd just shake his head. He could never quite explain it. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't fear. It was something else, a question with no answer. Who was he, and why had he spared them? Across the ocean, Franz Stigler was living a very different kind of peace. In Vancouver, Canada, he had built a quiet, stable life. The war had taken nearly everything: his homeland, his comrades, his brother August, who was shot down in 1940. He started again, working first as a mechanic, then as a businessman. He joined the local aviation community, repairing small aircraft, teaching young pilots the basics of flight. He rarely spoke of his years in the Luftwaffe. When people asked, he deflected politely. Some things were better left behind. But the memory of that crippled B-17 never left him. He would sometimes talk about it obliquely, a story of mercy, of choosing not to shoot. His wife would see the way his expression changed when he mentioned it. The pride, yes, but also something like sadness. Because Franz knew what that choice had cost him. During the war, sparing an enemy was considered treason. If anyone had reported what he did that day over Bremen, he could have been executed by firing squad. But even so, he had no regrets. In later years, when journalists asked why he hadn't pulled the trigger, Franz would say quietly, "I couldn't have shot them down. It would have been like shooting a man in a parachute." He had seen too much killing, young men burning, falling, dying alone in the sky. He had been raised to believe that honor meant something, even in war. Still, he often wondered what had happened to that bomber. Had it crashed? Had anyone survived? He had no way of knowing. The world before the internet was a world of silence. For Charlie, the silence grew heavier with time. He carried it like a stone in his chest. By the mid-1980s, he was retired, living in Miami, tinkering with inventions and mechanical projects. But his mind often drifted back to that day. It was a time of reflection for many veterans. The war was more than 40 years past. Old enemies were now allies. West Germany and the United States were partners in NATO. And yet, for men like Charlie, certain ghosts still lingered. In 1986, he received an invitation that would change everything. A gathering called the Gathering of Eagles, held in Boston. It was a reunion of combat aviators from every theater of the war, American, British, and even some German veterans now living in the West. Charlie hesitated, but something inside him said to go. At the event, the atmosphere buzzed with old camaraderie, laughter, stories, and the bittersweet pride of survivors. Men who had once faced death now compared notes like old classmates. During a panel discussion, someone asked Charlie if he had ever had a mission that truly stuck with him. He hesitated. Then he said, "Yes. One I've never been able to forget." And he told the story: the Bremen raid, the flak, the crippled bomber, and the German pilot who appeared beside them, guns silent, eyes steady. When he finished, the room fell quiet. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a few people approached him, intrigued. One of them said, "Did you ever try to find that German pilot?" Charlie blinked. The question hung in the air. "No," he said slowly, "I never did." That night in his hotel room, he couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the conversation in his mind. He had told the story dozens of times to friends or family, but never with that question at the end. He realized he had carried that mystery for 43 years. and had never once tried to solve it. The next morning, he made a decision. He would find the man who had spared him. He started with official channels. He wrote to the United States Air Force, requesting access to wartime encounter reports. He wrote to the Bundeswehr, the modern German Air Force, asking for any records of Luftwaffe pilots near Bremen on December 20th, 1943. Weeks passed, then months. Replies came back, polite but unhelpful. Records were incomplete, destroyed, or inaccessible. He contacted historians, archives, veteran associations. Each lead ended the same way: a dead end. The Luftwaffe's records, he learned, had been scattered or destroyed during the final months of the war. Some were seized by the Soviets, others lost in bombings or chaos. Finding one pilot from one day in 1943 was like searching for a single leaf in a forest after a storm. But Charlie couldn't let it go. Every time he saw an airplane overhead, every time he opened an old photo album, he thought of that German pilot, the man who had looked him in the eyes and chosen mercy over murder. He began writing letters to aviation magazines, veteran newsletters, and organizations that connected old pilots. He described everything he remembered: the type of aircraft, the markings, the time, the place. He wrote about the salute, that final gesture, the sign of respect that had stayed burned into his memory for more than 4 decades. Months passed. Nothing. Then came 1989. Charlie was 67 now, still strong, but aware of time slipping away. He sat at his desk one night, surrounded by papers, old mission logs, photographs of Ye Old Pub and its crew. He decided to make one last attempt. He wrote a detailed account, a full retelling of the event, and sent it to Combat Pilots International, a newsletter read by both Allied and German veterans. He didn't expect much. He just hoped someone, somewhere, might recognize it. Then, in January of 1990, a letter arrived. It was postmarked from Canada. Charlie opened it slowly, his hands trembling. Inside was a simple message, 4 words: "I was the one." He read it again, then again. I was the one. The letter went on to describe the incident, the damage to the bomber, the salute, the escort past the flak guns. The writer's name: Franz Stigler. Charlie sat in silence for a long time. Then he picked up the phone. When Franz answered, his German accent still thick after all those years, Charlie introduced himself. The two men talked for hours. Franz described his aircraft, the markings, the weather, the position of the sun, the look of the bomber's damage. Every detail matched perfectly. Charlie asked him why. Why had he done it? Franz was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I could not shoot. They were like men in parachutes. It would have been murder." The words hit Charlie like a wave. For 47 years, he had wondered what kind of man had spared them. Now he knew. The conversation went on late into the night. Franz told him he had often wondered if the bomber made it home. For decades, he had assumed it had crashed into the sea. He said that finding out they had survived felt like a blessing. For both men, something deep inside began to heal. Charlie slept soundly that night for the first time in years. Franz, too, felt a peace he hadn't known since the war. Over the next weeks, they exchanged letters, photos, memories. Plans formed. They would meet in person. Not as enemies, but as brothers. 6 months after that first phone call, it finally happened. Seattle, Washington, July 1990. The two men who had once faced each other through cracked glass and crosshairs were about to meet face to face. Charlie stood on the tarmac, hands in his pockets, his heart racing. He was older now, grey hair, slower step, but inside he felt like that 21-year-old pilot again, waiting for the German fighter to appear on his wing. A car pulled up, the door opened, and out stepped Franz Stigler. For a moment they just looked at each other, studying the lines of age, the years carved into their faces. Then Franz moved first. He walked forward quickly, eyes glistening. Charlie met him halfway. Without a word, they embraced. 2 old soldiers, 2 men bound by a moment that had lasted only minutes, but had defined their entire lives. When they finally pulled apart, Franz said quietly, "I love you, Charlie." Those were his first words. The cameras clicked, but neither of them seemed to notice. They were in their own world, a world that had begun 47 years earlier in the skies over Germany. They spent that entire day talking, laughing, remembering. Franz described what he had seen inside the bomber, the torn fuselage, the blood on the windows, the faces of men clinging to life. Charlie told him about the chaos on board, the wounded men, the desperate attempt to keep flying. Each man filled in the missing pieces for the other. For decades, they had each carried half of a story. Now, at last, they had the whole truth. Later that evening, Charlie brought Franz to meet surviving members of year-older pub's crew, men who owed their lives to Franz's choice. When the introductions were made, no one could speak for a moment. Then one of the former gunners stepped forward, tears in his eyes, and simply said, "Thank you." Franz nodded, overwhelmed. That night, over dinner, the men swapped stories of their post-war lives. Charlie's wife and Franz's wife, Jackie and Haya, met for the first time and connected instantly. They would remain close friends for the rest of their lives. The reunion didn't just close a chapter, it opened a new one. In the months that followed, Charlie and Franz became inseparable. They called each other every week. They sent letters, shared family photos, and visited each other often. Sometimes they would sit quietly together, watching airplanes take off. They didn't need words. Other times, they'd attend air shows and veterans gatherings, telling their story to anyone who would listen. They weren't just sharing a war story, they were sharing a lesson. About mercy, about conscience, about the shared humanity even between enemies. Franz once said, "When I saw that bomber, I thought of my own brother. I thought, what if those were his eyes looking back at me?" It was not sentimentality, it was something deeper, the understanding that compassion and courage are not opposites. They are the same thing. In 1991, they were invited to speak together publicly for the first time. The room was packed. When the two men walked onto the stage, the audience rose to their feet in applause that lasted nearly a minute. Charlie began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "This man," he said, gesturing to Franz, "gave me my life. And because of him, my crew went home. They got to marry, have children, and live their lives. Everything that came after, every grandchild, every moment, began because one man chose not to pull a trigger." The crowd was silent. Many were crying. Franz spoke next. His English was careful, deliberate. "I could not shoot. They were helpless. I could not shoot. I would rather have been shot down myself than see those men die like that." From that day on, their story spread. Aviation magazines wrote about them. Newspapers ran headlines calling it the gentleman's duel. Historians began referencing the encounter as one of the most extraordinary acts of chivalry in modern warfare, but neither man saw themselves as heroes. Charlie used to say, "The hero of that story isn't me, it's Franz." And Franz would always shake his head and reply, "No, my friend. We both did what we had to do." As their friendship deepened, their families became one extended family. Charlie's grandchildren called Franz Uncle Franz. The Stiglers spent Christmas with the Browns whenever they could. They sent birthday cards, photos, long handwritten letters filled with warmth and gratitude. It was as if they were trying to make up for all the years they had lost. Sometimes, when they spoke on the phone, Charlie would say, "You know, Franz, I still can't believe we found each other." And Franz would laugh softly and answer, "It was meant to be, Charlie. God wanted us to meet again." In 1995, they visited an aviation museum together in Florida, where a restored B-17 stood gleaming under the lights. The guide didn't know who they were. He began explaining how dangerous those missions had been, how many crews never returned. Then Franz quietly said, "I remember. I was there." The guide turned, puzzled. Charlie smiled and said, "You're looking at the two men from one of those missions." Slowly, the story unfolded, and by the time they were done, there wasn't a dry eye in the hangar. One afternoon during a visit to Miami, Franz handed Charlie a small wrapped package. Inside was a book, a pilot's logbook bound in leather. On the inside cover, Franz had written in neat handwriting, "In 1940, I lost my only brother as a night fighter. Thanks, Charlie. Your brother, Franz." Charlie closed the book and looked up at him, speechless. The words said everything. They didn't talk about politics or ideology or the reasons nations go to war. They talked about people, about how fragile life is and how one act of mercy can echo through generations. But not everyone understood. In Germany, some old veterans called Franz a traitor. They said he had betrayed his comrades by sparing an enemy. In Canada, a few people who learned of his past as a Luftwaffe pilot called him a Nazi, refusing to see beyond the uniform he had once worn. Franz's response was always calm. "They will never understand," he said, "but Charlie does. And that's enough." And for him, it was. For both of them, the friendship became a second chance, a reminder that even the darkest wars can't destroy the humanity inside us. As the years passed, they grew older together. Their health declined, their movements slowed, but their bond only strengthened. They still called each other every week, no matter where they were. They still signed their letters, "Your brother in the skies." Sometimes when Charlie spoke about Franz at events, his voice would tremble with emotion. He'd say, "I've been asked 100 times what I think about that German pilot. And my answer never changes. He was the best man I ever met." For Franz, meeting Charlie and his crew became the one bright light in the shadow of all the years of war. He said once, "That day in 1943, I lost my appetite for victory. I realized that I didn't want to win a war by killing men who couldn't fight back. Meeting Charlie later proved that I was right to believe in mercy." When they traveled together, they were often stopped by strangers who had heard their story. People would shake their hands, thank them for showing what humanity could look like, even in war. One young pilot once asked Franz, "If you had shot them down that day, no one would have blamed you. Why didn't you?" Franz smiled faintly, "Because I would have blamed myself." Charlie's eyes would always glisten when he heard him say that. By the late 1990s, their story had reached historians, authors, and filmmakers. Interviews were recorded, photos of their reunion spread across the world. But fame meant little to them. What mattered was friendship, and the peace that came with finally understanding the man on the other side of the gun. At one of their last public talks, Charlie looked out at the audience and said, "Franz taught me something I will never forget. You can be enemies in war, but you never have to be enemies in your heart." Franz nodded beside him, smiling quietly. Their story was no longer just about a single moment in 1943. It had become a testament, proof that conscience and compassion can survive even in a world consumed by hate. They had become living symbols of reconciliation. Whenever they stood together, people saw not a German and an American, but two men who had chosen humanity over duty, friendship over vengeance. They knew their time was running short, but they also knew that the story would outlive them, and that, for both of them, was enough. As the years slipped quietly toward their twilight, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler both understood that time, that relentless, merciless enemy, was closing in. But unlike the sky over Bremen, there was no fear in this battle, only gratitude. They had already won the most important fight, the one for their own humanity. In their final decade together, they slowed down, yet they never drifted apart. Phone calls became shorter, the handwriting on their letters a little shakier, but the warmth between them never dimmed. Each call ended the same way. Franz would say, "Goodbye, my brother in the skies." Charlie would answer, "Until we meet again, Franz." They had shared 18 years of friendship, more time together in peace than they'd ever spent as enemies in war. When journalists visited, they spoke not of airplanes or medals, but of forgiveness. Charlie would sit in his Miami workshop, surrounded by model planes, and say softly, "You know, people ask me if I still think about that mission. I do, every day. But now I think about what came after. About how a man who should have been my enemy became my best friend." Franz, in his home near Vancouver, would tell young pilots, "Don't ever think compassion makes you weak. It takes far more courage to show mercy than to take revenge." They both appeared on television programs, in classrooms, and at veterans' events. Everywhere they went, people listened in silence. Because their story wasn't just history, it was hope. And as they aged, that hope spread. Teachers began sharing their encounter as a lesson in ethics. Military academies used it to teach moral judgment under pressure. Psychologists referenced it in studies on post-traumatic healing. How understanding and forgiveness can silence nightmares that medicine never could. One of Charlie's old crewmates once said, "When we learned Franz was alive, it was like a light switched on inside of Charlie. He laughed again. He slept again. That German pilot gave him peace twice. once in war and once in life. In 2003, 60 years after their encounter, a new generation discovered them. An author named Adam Makos heard whispers of the story. Two men, one from each side, who had met in mercy. He spent years interviewing them, recording every detail, every memory before it could fade. Those conversations became a book, a higher call. When it was published, the world finally saw what their families had always known, that compassion can fly higher than hatred. The book became a bestseller. Letters poured in from veterans, soldiers, and ordinary people, moved to tears. Franz and Charlie read those letters together when they met. Some were from children. One read, "I didn't know heroes could be on both sides." Another said, "You made me believe that even in war, good men can exist." Charlie would smile and say, "That's why we tell it. So they'll remember." By then, both men were well into their 80s. Their bodies frail, their hearing fading, but their friendship stronger than ever. When they couldn't travel, they still spoke every Sunday afternoon. The same ritual they'd kept for nearly 2 decades. If one was late calling, the other would worry until the phone rang. They had become, in every way, brothers. And then, quietly, as life always does, the end came. March 22, 2008. Vancouver, Canada. Franz Stigler, age 92, passed away peacefully in his sleep. When the news reached Miami, Charlie sat for a long time without speaking. Then he said only, "My brother's gone home." 8 months later, on November 24, 2008, Charlie Brown followed him. He was 86. 2 graves, thousands of miles apart. One in North America's far west, one in the southeast. Yet their spirits forever joined in that same endless sky where their story began. Friends and family from both sides of the Atlantic wrote the same words. It feels as if they just took off together again. Their passing closed the final chapter of a friendship that had spanned continents and bridged what once seemed unbridgeable. But their story did not end there. Because stories like this don't belong only to the men who lived them. They belong to all of us. Today, their encounter is taught in schools, told in documentaries, remembered in museums. A restored B-17 bearing the name Ye Olde Pub tours the skies at air shows. Sometimes, when it soars through the clouds, spectators swear they can almost see a second plane flying beside it, a small, sleek Messerschmitt keeping quiet formation. It's as if, somewhere beyond our sight, Charlie and Franz are flying together again. 2 old pilots at peace at last. Their story endures because it asks a question as old as humanity itself. When everything around you says hate, will you still choose compassion? When duty demands destruction, will you still recognize the person inside the uniform? Franz Stigler once said, "You can always choose the right thing, even in the wrong place." Charlie Brown said, "Franz taught me that even in war, the rules of humanity still apply." Together, they proved that decency can survive the madness of battle, and their legacy continues to ripple outward, through every person who hears their story and pauses to think, "What would I have done?" Maybe that's why their bond feels so timeless. Because at its heart, it isn't a story about planes or bullets or nations. It's a story about people, about how one act of mercy can echo across generations. 2 pilots, enemies for 10 minutes, brothers for the rest of their lives. 47 years to find each other, 18 years together. 8 months apart in death, as if the sky itself refused to let one fly without the other. So the next time you look up and see a contrail crossing the blue, remember them. Remember that somewhere in our shared past, amid the smoke and chaos of the Second World War, 2 men looked across the guns and chose something higher. Not victory, not vengeance, but mercy. That's what makes their story more than history. That's what makes it human. Because when we strip away the flags, the uniforms, and the causes, what's left is the simple truth that saved 10 lives that day. The truth Franz Stigler lived and Charlie Brown never forgot. That compassion, even in war, is the highest call of all. This is not just a war story. This is a story about what it means to be human.